Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Khalid Saoudi, Marketing Assistant at AUC Press. Our book discussion today should last about an hour, and it is recorded and will be uploaded to our AUC Press Facebook page and YouTube channel afterwards. We will have room for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, please make sure you type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for those joining us on Facebook Live, please type in your questions in the comment section, and we will ask them on your behalf. Today's book is the newly published State, Peasants, and Land in Mid-Nineteenth-Century Egypt by Dr. Maha Ghalwash, which examines the rural history of Egypt during a period that is often glossed over or altogether forgotten. Drawing on a wide array of archival sources, some only rarely utilized by other scholars, it offers an alternative reading of the relationship between the state and smallholder peasants in mid-19th century Egypt. The book was recently published by AUC Press in May 2023, and you could order your copy from major bookstores and online book retailers worldwide and in Egypt from AUC bookstores. We are delighted to have with us today our author, Dr. Maha Ghalwash, who holds a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University and currently teaches at the British University in Egypt, where she is founding member of the Department of Political Science. Her research on 19th century Egypt focuses on peasants, society, socioeconomic developments, the impact of law on society, peasant petitioning activity, peasant land tenure regime, women's rights to land, and state-peasant relations. She also is interested in Islamist movement in present-day Egypt, focusing on the Salafi movement, Salafi political parties, politics of the veil, and Islamist state relations. And our discussant and moderator today is Dr. Zainab Abul Majd, Professor of Middle East History at Oberlin College. She received her PhD in History and Political Economy and MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University, Washington, D.C., and BA in Political Sciences from Cairo University, Egypt. Her first book, Imagined Empires, A History of Revolt in Egypt, won the Mesa Conference's Roger Owen Book Award in 2015. Its Arabic translation appeared as إمبراطوريات متخيلة تاريخ الثورة في صعيد مصر. Her latest book is Militarizing the Nation, Army, Business, and Revolution in Egypt. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, and I will now leave the floor to Dr. Zainab Abul Majd.
Thank you so much, Khalid. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you to AUC Press in general for it was really a great pleasure reading this book before it came out, and it's a great pleasure to participate now in discussing it. I'm really excited about today's session, and I'm really looking forward to hear what Dr. Maha, the great ideas she will share, the great reflections she will share with us today about the book. And I have a number of questions to ask her, but as Khalid mentioned, please, the audience, please feel free to write your any questions that might come to your mind in the Q&A box, and I will make sure to pass them to Dr. Maha as we go through the discussion. So Dr. Maha, thank you for including me in this. It was really a very informative and a delight to read. This book was a delight to read. So this is a very extremely rich history of Egyptian countryside, relation between state and peasants, and land ownership in the Egyptian countryside, focusing on mainly Delta villages, focusing mainly on northern Egypt, and specifically two provinces in the Delta, Al-Gharbiya and Al-Yubiya. And this, I mean, you decided to focus on the very important period in Egyptian modern history, which is the 19th century. It's essential to understand the 19th century in order to understand anything about modern Egypt. But in addition to that, you decided to focus on a small window of time, a number of years that are usually very understudied, are usually very ignored, neglected by historians of Egypt, Egyptian and Western historians of Egypt. And these are the period of the middle of the century between Khidewi, Abbas Pasha, and Said Pasha's years. Specifically, the years of Abbas Pasha are seen by a lot of historians years, including me myself. I used to look at Abbas Pasha as dead 6 years, the period between 1848 when Muhammad Ali Pasha died and 1854 when Said Pasha came to power. I always saw this as dead years, but you really bring it to life here, full life here with vivid stories, vivid voices of peasants, and you show us a very complex relation between the state and the peasants here. So having highlighted this, because I really needed to highlight the importance of the time period you study here to the audience to make sure that they understand the value of the study. So I'm gonna begin by asking you about the journey to reach this study and the journey of writing this book. I have a couple of questions to ask you about this. The first one, or three questions actually. The first one is how and why you landed this topic of land, peasants, land, state in that period of Egyptian 19th century Egyptian history. In other words, what brought this topic to your attention, and what made you decide to dedicate so many years of your life to it? I mean, your journey with this book really started many years ago when you were just a graduate student in graduate school, trying to figure out what to write about, trying to choose a topic that you like enough and you're passionate about enough to live with for so many years to write a dissertation, and then a few more years to turn that dissertation into a book. This is a big commitment of a long number of years. So what made you, how you landed this topic, and what made you decide that this is it, this is what I'm going to spend all this time, all these years of my life with? This is my first question. My second question is, what do you think? I mean, a lot of historians wrote about the 19th century. A lot of historians wrote about land ownership and peasants in northern Egypt, Upper Egypt, right? So, what do you think you did differently here in this book when you digged into when you examine the archival material that maybe other historians looked at? What do you think you did differently than them, right? Whether Egyptian or Western historians who wrote about almost the same topic. And then my third question here is, what ideas, when you went to the archives to start doing research for this topic, you went to the archives with certain ideas, maybe certain assumptions, maybe how much these assumptions, arguments changed after you finished archival research or after you writing the book? What you had in mind when you started was the same that you had in mind when you finished? Change in ideas, change in perceptions happened during the years of working on this book. So I will leave the floor now to Dr. Maha, but also I'm going to keep close eye on the Q&A box in case there are important questions coming soon. Dr. Maha.
Thank you, Zainab. Before I start, I want to thank certain individuals. I want to thank Nadia Naqib, Senior Acquisition Editor at AUC Press, for supporting my book project. I want to thank Laura Gribben and Christine Mara for guiding me through the publication process. I want to thank Susan Qanawi and Khalid Saoudi for organizing the session. And last but not least, I want to thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. Regarding my journey in the research and development of my topic, I want to start by pointing out that this is an empirically driven study. And what I mean by that is that it's based on an array of archival sources that are housed in the Egyptian National Archives and in the Ministry of Finance archives. Now, when I started this project, I started with a vague idea of what I wanted to do. I only knew two things, and that was that I was going to focus on the mid-19th century because it seemed like a period that very few people had looked at. And number two, I wanted to avoid high politics. Instead, I wanted to develop a topic that dealt with state-society relations. So the first thing I did was that I went to the Egyptian National Archives, and there I began examining the Islamic court registers. These are Mahakim Shariah registers. And there I found that these registers were absolutely replete with cases that deal with peasant disputes over land. So this is when I decided that this is a very rich topic, that and I decided that I would focus on peasant-state relations. But the next step was to find a source that would give me an idea of the situation of land tenure in peasant villages. Here I had to go to the Ministry of Finance archives, the Dar al-Mahfuzat. And there I was lucky enough to find a set of registers that have been underutilized by scholars. And here I'm referring to the Athurat registers. Now, this type of register lists the names of all the smallholders in a village. And at the same time, it also explains how each holder acquired the land in his possession. So this is a very unique source. And when I examined it, when I studied it very, very closely, I found two things. Number one was that the majority of holders in a village were poor. They possessed less than 5 fidats. Now, this is not surprising, but the other point that did surprise me was the fact that almost all the poor peasants had acquired their holdings by land assignment, which means that the state and village authorities assigned land to poor peasants in order to ensure that they possessed a means of livelihood. So here I realized that the mid-century state was an absolutist state that was not indifferent toward peasant well-being. And it's at this point that I recalled the literature and what the literature has to say about peasant-state relations during the 19th century. And if you remember, in general, the literature paints the state as being indifferent to peasant well-being, as being very harsh on the peasants. But what I found in the Athurat registers suggested the opposite. So the next step here was to go back to the Egyptian National Archives, because at this point I needed to get a sense of state views and state perspectives. So it's at this point that I asked myself, now, am I going to find confirmation of what I found in the Athurat registers when I examine a different set of registers that that delineate peasant views and peasant perspectives, or would I find confirmation of what was written in the literature? So I went to the Egyptian National Archives again, and there I examined different types of civil court registers. And the examination of these registers enabled me to see that state policy pertaining to peasant lands was shaped by two economic precepts. These are the maximization of revenues and the preservation of peasant economic viability. Then it's at this point. So it's at this point that this is when my ideas really took shape. And after discerning state policy and the fact that it was shaped by these two economic precepts, I needed to determine, or I needed to discern the impact of state policy on the peasants. And this necessitated going back to the Ministry of Finance archives, and here I examined the village tax, land tax registers. And what these showed me was that the majority of peasant smallholders remained economically viable during the mid-century period. Now, to conclude this very brief overview of my work, I point out that in researching this project, I found it necessary to rethink three assumptions of the current literature. The first is that the state was alienated from and showed no mercy toward the producing groups. The second assumption that I needed to rethink was that peasants shunned the state. And the third specified that peasants experience widespread poverty at mid-century. Now, you asked me what it is that I did so differently from other scholars. I think that
can I ask a follow-up question first before we move to this point? So while you're taking that journey, did you have to make decisions about the nature of that state? Because historians of Egypt, we look at the 19th century Egyptian state as a modern state, right? But the philosophy, the philosophical, framework you just described about the state of Abbas and Said, it doesn't sound so modern. It sounds maybe closer to the Ottoman imperial government in Istanbul. Did you have to wrestle with this and make decisions about how to classify that state?
Yes. Well, I didn't classify it as a modern, well, it was a state that was engaging in the modernization of the country. But at the same time, what I tried to point out was that during the mid-century period, with the start of the Abbas Pasha period, the Egyptian ruling elite was no longer seeking guidance from Europe. Instead, we all know that Abbas Pasha was disenchanted with the West, and at the same time, he felt that his grandfather had pushed the country too fast and too hard. And so it was during his time when he was looking elsewhere for guidance, and specifically he looked towards Istanbul. Now, remember that the Egyptian ruling elite was not really Egyptian, it was Ottoman Egyptian, which meant that they were very familiar with the ideas of Ottoman high political culture. And so when I talk about the economic precepts, what I'm really talking about is what I'm trying to say is that the ruling elite drew from a philosophy of statecraft that they were familiar with, and it was a philosophy of statecraft that was prevalent in the Ottoman Empire in Istanbul, and so they were drawing from these ideas. Here we're talking about the circle of equity, and this whole philosophy of statecraft has two economic precepts, two economic principles. And what I try to argue is that these two economic precepts shaped government policy, shaped state policy during the mid-19th century. So it started with Abbas and it carried over into the Said period. However, Said was different from Abbas. Now, when Said came to power, he wanted to be viewed as an enlightened leader, as the benevolent monarch. And for this reason, when he first came to power, the first thing he did was abolish a whole array of taxes, a whole array of peasant taxes. But at the same time, he was caught by the modernization bug. He was unlike Abbas Pasha, who slowed down the modernization project. But Said Pasha, with time, wanted to modernize and introduced a number of modernization projects. And what this meant was that he needed more money. And what was the most important sector that the government drew its revenues from? This was the agricultural sector. And so we see Said increasing taxes over time by high levels. Okay, so at the end of the period, what I say is that there was no longer this intent to balance between the two economic precepts. Instead, the Said Pasha was more interested in maximizing revenues. And at times this came at the expense of peasants' economic viability. Whereas during the Abbas Pasha's period, there was a more concerted effort to balance between the two economic precepts. So he tried to maximize revenues, but in a way that did not come at the expense of peasants' economic viability.
But you notice Ottoman rhetoric in both governments, both
yes.
and Said.
Yes.
You notice obvious Ottoman rhetoric, except that Said brought back modernization to his political discourse.
Well, he was interested in modernizing, and at the same time, even though I argue that they were the state drew from this philosophy and drew ideas from this philosophy of statecraft. During Said's time, he was no longer trying to balance between the two economic precepts. Instead, he was more interested in maximization of revenues.
Yes.
You see?
Okay.
Okay, so you asked me what it is that I did differently. It's not that what it is that I did differently, it's what is the nature of the sources that I focused on. Okay, now my most important source was the Athurat registers. This is a very unique set of registers, and they were compiled only once. So each village has one register, and it was compiled only once and never again. Now, this register lists the names of each of the peasant holders, but at the same time, it also tells us how peasants acquired their land. This is a very unique source.
What happened? Which year it was compiled?
Well, most villages compiled this particular source in 1859, 1860.
So the land law.
But there were some villages where this particular register was compiled earlier. Earlier, do you see? And so when one Egyptian historian, one of the first Egyptian historians to examine the source was Professor Ali Shalabi, and he had concluded that Said Basha had given instructions for the compilation of this particular source because he wanted to see the extent of the implementation of the 1858 law, which he had just passed. But when I was in the Ministry of Finance archives, I was lucky enough to be able to find other registers or other registers that were compiled earlier. And so this is when I realized that no, Said Basha was not only interested in the level of implementation of the 1858 law. No, he just wanted to understand the land tenure situation in peasant villages, because I found registers, Athurat registers, that were compiled several years earlier. It's just that most of them, there was greater urgency for the compilation of this type of source, this type of register, after the passage of the 1858 law. You see? So, now,
the earlier one commissioned by Abbas, the earlier one.
No, they were not. No, I don't think any of them. I don't think Abbas Basha ever gave instructions for the compilation of this kind of source. I think that it was Said Basha that instructed the provincial officials to compile this kind of source, because he wanted to understand the situation of land tenure in each of the peasant villages. You see, he was concerned with the whole idea of surplus lands, the fact that peasants were cultivating land secretly. So he wanted to know what was going on at the village level. He wanted as much information as he could possibly get. And so this is why I believe that he gave these instructions. Now, it's with the passage of the 1858 law that there was more urgency here for the completion of this kind of project. And so this is why when you go to Dar al-Mahfuzat, if you're lucky enough to be able to actually visit one of the storage rooms, you will find that most of this kind of registers, most of the Athurat registers were compiled between 1859 and 1860. You see, now you asked me what it is that I did differently.
Yes.
It's not that what I did differently, it's the nature of the sources that I was able to find. Do you see? Like the Athurat registers, other scholars, like I said, Professor Ali Shalabi found them, scholar Muhammad Hakim used them, Professor Ali Barakat looked at them. But the thing is that I felt that they looked at them only to examine one point, and that was it. okay? But I did something different, which is that I looked at them very, very carefully, spending months and months and months just copying out all the details, okay? Because as you know, at the Egyptian archives, they do not allow us to photocopy, okay? And so it means that you spend long hours and many, many days just copying material out, okay? And what I did was I tried to understand the situation of the village in its entirety. You see, what Professor Ali Shalabi did was that he simply looked at the land holding of the village sheikhs, and he said, well, I see that village sheikhs acquired most of their land by land assignment. And this way, he concluded that village sheikhs were greedy, and village sheikhs they competed for land assignments. Okay, but you know, I felt that if you look at this source more closely, there's so much more you can learn from it. So what I saw from it was when I looked at the holdings of each of the poor peasants, I found that they too acquired their land, or they acquired much of their holdings by land assignment. So that meant that state and village authorities were taking care to give land to poor peasants because they wanted to ensure that they possessed a means of livelihood. And at the same time, what was really helpful was the situation of women. When we look at what has been written about women, we understand that on the whole, there are very few women smallholders. Okay, that's generally right. But when you compare between the village land tax registers and the village athurat register, you find that there actually is a much higher number of women smallholders. It's just that they often did not like to register the land in their name. They generally like to register their land in the name of a male caretaker, a male representative, in Arabic, the wakil. And so what you see in the land tax registers is the name of the wakil, the name of the wad al-yad. So for all intents and purposes, or in the eyes of the state, the man possesses the land, not the woman. But then you look at the village athurat register, and here, this is where you see women being specified as the possessor of this land. It's just that most women like to consign their land to a male caretaker. Okay, now women were also smart, and they knew that if they allowed this land to remain in the possession of a certain man for too long a time, he could actually claim it as his own. And so you will, what the Athurat register shows us is that women most often like to place their land in the hands of their husbands or sons, or sometimes fathers. But then there were those women who didn't have close male relatives. And so what did they do? They would consign this land to a male caretaker for a short period of time. And then after maybe a space of 1 or 2 years, change this male caretaker in order to ensure that this male caretaker did not claim this land on for himself.
That's it. Maha, before we move away from this point, so what did you did differently regarding Abbas period? Because I believe this is one unique aspect of your research here, the focus on Abbas, the period that I see as dead years, but you see as active years. So what did you did? What kind of different light you shed on Abbas versus Said? Obviously, you didn't find enough about Abbas in the Athurat records, but you found enough about him in Mahakim Shar'iyya and other records, right?
Yes. Regarding the Abbas period, now, like I said, this was a time, or Abbas Pasha generally believed that his grandfather had pushed the country too hard, too fast. And so what I found from the examination of a source, a set of registers, this is called the tax reassessment registers, and in Arabic, Dafatar Takmil al-Darayib. Now, what this set of registers details is the details pertaining to a tax reassessment project.
Mhm.
And what I found was that Abbas Basha did not try to increase taxes, peasant taxes, while he was in power. It was only towards the very end of his reign that he thought to increase taxes. But again, when he was considering this idea of increasing taxes, he wasn't going to impose higher taxes on all peasant land. Instead, he focused only on ibadiyya lands, or lands that had been that were originally barren and then brought under cultivation. And so what we're talking about is increasing taxes for roughly 11% of peasant land. Do you see? So I felt that this illustrates this concern to maximize revenues while ensuring that peasants remained economically viable.
Got you. All right. Thank you, Maha. I think let's switch to another point. We'll remain in the archive still, but dig deeper in certain issues in the archive, in the Egyptian archives. Obviously, for us historians, our destination of research are Dar al-Wasaiq and Dar al-Mahfuzat. For me, for example, my destination was Dar al-Wasaiq. Mainly, I never went to Dar al-Mahfuzat, but you do a great, amazing job here by combining both records from Dar al-Wasaiq as well as spending a lot of time in Dar al-Mahfuzat and bringing to light all these kind of stories from Sigillat al-Asurat. So I have a couple of questions for you regarding what you did in the archives, what the actual stuff you did in the archives. First question is, can you share with us your experience, day in, day out in the archives? Those of us who did research in the Egyptian archives, we know that it's a very, very difficult thing to do. Some days it's very challenging, a very challenging thing to do, and you spend so many months in one research hall, and some days you get good information, some other days you're frustrated, you get nothing, and also you have the bigger picture of the administrative system there, the government employees there. So what was your experience like in Dar al-Wasaiq and Dar al-Mahfuzat? How did you maneuver administrative matters, and how you navigated overwhelming collections? Because also we know very well that the Egyptian archives are amazing in terms of the large number of records they have, but they are not very well organized, or they are not digitized, and they're not easy really to find stuff in. So how did you maneuver all this? This is my first question. And then my second question, because you looked at hundreds, thousands of records, and you draw so many amazing stories of peasants talking to the state and the state talking back to them. Can you share with us some of some juicy narratives that you got from the archives?
Yes. Well, first of all, my experience in Dar al-Wasaiq, the Egyptian National Archives, and my experience in Dar al-Mahfuzat, or the Ministry of Finance Archives. My experience with the Dar al-Wasaiq archives, I found that they are generally very well organized, but at the same time, when it came time to select a certain set of sources to examine, my selection of a source depended on how complete it seemed. So for example, if I was going to choose between looking at the Council of Justice registers, these are the Sigillat Majlis al-Ahkam, or if I wanted to focus on, for example, the Vice-Regal Cabinet registers, it would depend on whether the registers that focused on agricultural matters, that focused on rural areas, was complete. If it wasn't complete, I wouldn't look at it. I tried to choose a set of registers if I could see that the registers covered the entire period that I was looking at. In Dar al-Wasaiq, I found the employees to be very, very helpful, and they would allow me to accumulate huge piles of registers on my desk. And so that meant that when I got there in the morning, I didn't have to wait until they brought these registers to my desk. But what I also found was comparing between original documents that are stored in boxes. These are called the mahafis, and the registers. Now, I particularly I preferred the registers because the registers contained summaries of the original documents and also included the state's comments, the state's views on a peasant's petition. And this is what I was looking for. I was looking for dialogue. I thought that if I focused on the original petitions, I would only see the peasants' complaints. Okay, that's very good. But I was more interested in learning the peasants, the state's reaction to these complaints. And so that's why I focus most of my research on the registers. But the boxes or the mahafis are helpful when you want to look at original texts of laws. And this was very helpful for me because this is where I found the original texts of the 1847 law, the 1855 law, and where I found the original text of Abbas Besha's law on corvée. And I found a number of original texts for very important laws, and I mentioned them in the book. But on the whole, like I said, what I was really interested in is this dialogue between peasants and the state. I wanted to learn the state's views on peasants' complaints. So I focused most of my research on the registers of the different civil courts. Regarding the Dar al-Mahfuzat, the employees there are very, very kind and very, very helpful. And so on the one hand, they don't have detailed indexes that you can look at, okay? So what they did for me was they actually allowed me to go into the storage rooms, and this is where I just hunted. This is how I found the Athurat registers that I focused on. And while in the storage rooms, I found this very important source, and this is the tax reassessment registers, in Arabic, Dafatir Takmil al-Daraib. And this type of register details the tax increases that were imposed on all the villages of a province. So when I was looking at Gharbiya province, I was looking at the situation of roughly 400 villages. And later, the later tax projects were introduced after the state had expanded the boundaries of Gharbiya province and included some of the areas of Munafiyah province. And so that meant I was looking at what happened to roughly 700 villages. So I got a good sense of what the implementation or what the introduction of a tax project really meant for the peasants. I had a sense of the extent to which tax rates were increased. Okay. And in some cases, as I show, tax rate, when the state imposed or when the state introduced a tax project, this did not necessarily bring tax increases. In some instances, it meant that tax officials had reassessed the land, had reassessed tax rates, and decided that tax rates should decrease. I found that interesting. I had never heard of the state deciding that taxes for a certain area need to be decreased, because previously they had asked, the taxes they had asked for were too high.
Yeah. Maha, so your favorite type of sigillat are al-athurat, obviously, and whatever you found in Dar al-Mahfuzat and the Ministry of Finance, but you kept going back and forth between Dar al-Mahfuzat and Dar al-Wathaiq, and Dar al-Wathaiq has sigillat al-Mahakim al-Shar'iyya, and you use like Mahkamat al-Khanka fi al-Alubiyya, Mahkamat Tanta fi al-Dahliyya, and various other Mahakim Shar'iyya, and you also use civil courts, Majlis al-Ahkam. So how do you think this complemented or supplemented that? Al-Athurat are your basic, your core place of research. How do you think Mahakim Shar'iyya and Majlis al-Ahkam, this is where you found the voices of the peasants versus where you found the state talking about its laws, about its taxation?
Yes. See, the Athurat registers told me what was happening at the peasant at the level of the peasant villages, but then I needed to hear peasant voices. And for peasant voices, I went to the Islamic court registers, but I also went to the civil court registers. You see, there I could also hear peasant voices, but the civil court registers also included state views. And the Islamic court registers are also helpful because we need to remember that the peasants often like to use the Islamic courts because the adjudication there was immediate. You know, a peasant would go to the court and he would present his case and the judge would decide usually on that day. On the other hand, peasants were also very cognizant of state institutions, and they were cognizant of new laws and new rules. And so they knew that the new civil courts could issue verdicts that would override decisions issued by the Islamic court. So I have cases where, for example, a peasant would take its case to the Islamic court and a certain decision would be issued, but the peasant was not happy with this decision. And so I would see him, I could follow him going to a civil court and presenting his case again. Now, the thing is that peasants were understood that these courts had higher authority, had more power than the Islamic courts. And but the problem there was that adjudication there took time, and it was not in person. They had to present all their documents, and the legal counsel there would examine these documents and then get back to them. So it took time. See? So
some examples of cases.
Share with you some examples, of course. But when I start sharing some of these examples, I would like to start with a case that from my favorite source, which is the Athurat registers. And here, what I want to highlight here is state tolerance for unique village practices that actually violated the law. Okay, so here I'm talking about a case from Jazeera Alhadra. This is a village located in Al-Gharbiya province. Now, this village, the agricultural land of this village was divided between two basins. There was Al-Farsha Basin, which comprised the high quality land of this village. And then there was Hod, or the Al-Nakhil Basin, which comprised low quality land. Now, the point is that after 1858, the village refused to allow women to inherit land in the inherit land if it was situated in Al-Farsha Hod, or in Al-Farsha Basin. And what they specifically say here, I'm going to read to you what was recorded in the Athurat register of Jazeera Alhadra village. They specify land in Al-Farsha Basin is the right of men only, to the exclusion of women, because it is cleared for cultivation and has no trees, and thus women have no rights in this basin, despite the passage of the 1858 land law.
Which allows
Yes, now we need to recall that the 1858 land law had specified that women were to inherit land according to Islamic rules of inheritance, which meant that according to this law, women should have been allowed to inherit land that lay in Al-Farsha Basin. But in this village, the village headmen had agreed that women would be denied the right to inherit land if it lay in this particular basin. So
and accepted that. The state tolerated that, accepted that.
Exactly.
The peasants.
Exactly.
So this
exactly.
is the state responding positively, but in the wrong place,
Yes. But the point is that this was a village custom, and the state condoned this practice, even though this practice did not align with state law. Okay? So this is a case from a case from my favorite source, which is the Afraad registers. But at the same time, I also have cases which demonstrate which show us that there were times when peasant complaints prompted the state to modify its decision. And so here I want to talk about the system of tax credits. Now, the system of tax credits allowed peasants to pay by the system of tax credits, peasants could pay their tax installments, and in addition, they could pay additional sums in taxes, and these sums would transform into tax credit that they could access at a later point in time. Now, in 1856, the government or the state decided that it wanted to abolish this system, and it insisted that peasants were to pay their tax installments in full, and they didn't want them to accumulate tax credits. Now, here the peasants complained. And what did they say? They said, no, this is too hard for us, because you have to remember that some tax installments have to be paid during a time when our crops are still in the ground and we have no money. And then there are other tax installments that are to be paid when our harvest is in, and we do have enough money to pay our installments. And we would rather pay additional sums in tax credits so that we can cover those times when our crops are still in the ground. And so as a result of these complaints, the government reversed its decision. It said, okay, I'm not going to completely abolish this system. Instead, I will, what the state said was that peasants were allowed to accumulate tax credits during the current financial year, but they were not allowed to accumulate tax credits that would carry over into the following financial year.
Yeah.
So the point is,
this is a great example, because as opposed to the previous example you shared, in which the state responded, but responded positively, but while doing this, it harmed other social groups, women here. In the second case, it responded positively for the good of the whole village. Everybody benefited, nobody was harmed by the state decision here.
Yes. Well, I go into more detail in the book, and I show you that actually as a result of the restriction, this particular restriction of the right to accumulate tax credits, what actually happened was that poorer people in the village could not expect to be allowed to access tax credits of their wealthier neighbors. Do you see? So I explained this in more detail. So on the one hand, the peasants did win the right to accumulate tax credits, but only for a limited period of time. And because the time period was so limited, this meant that wealthier villagers were not so generous with their tax credits as they had been in the past. You see? So in the end, what I say is that, yes, the state did respond to peasant demands, but in the end, this really did harm the poorer peasants in the village.
Yeah. And it shows you I think both examples, they show us the limitations of the modernizing state. The modernizing state tries to do lots of things, but sometimes it hits the brick wall of resistance from the ground, from local communities, for good reasons or bad reasons. So the modernizing state is not like all powerful that is able to implement all of its laws. So it has, especially speaking of Said here, Abbas was not so modernizing of a state, but Said was an ambitious state like his father's Muhammad Ali Pasha state, but he would face this pushback from the peasants.
Yes.
I'm not taking his side against the peasants, I'm just saying.
No, I see that. But there is another very nice example which highlights state responsiveness to peasant demands. And here I'm going to talk about state expropriation of peasant land. Now, when the state needed peasant land in order to construct or for public works projects, or in order to enhance, for example, irrigation infrastructure of the village, what it would do is it would take this land from the peasants. It was expropriated, and at the same time, it did not compensate the peasant either with money or with another tract of land. And at the same time, the peasant remained responsible for its tax payments. There was no tax exemption. Okay, so peasants complained bitterly about this. Let me give you an example. In December 1855, Sheikh Muhammad al-Sharqawi of Sandawa village explained to the viceregal cabinet that the government had taken a section of his land.
That village? The Sandawa village.
Sandawa village.
Where?
Sandawa village, Gharbiya. Gharbiya, okay? And he explained to the viceregal cabinet that the government had taken a section of his land for the new dike in the village, but at the same time, they didn't give him anything in compensation. So he had written this petition asking for land in compensation for the land that had been expropriated. Then another petitioner only asked for one thing. He said, cancel the taxes. I should not be forced to continue to pay for taxes. I should not be forced to continue to pay taxes for land that is no longer in my possession. And so here, the writers of the 1858 law noticed these complaints and addressed them. And so in the 1858 law, we see that henceforth expropriated land would be exempted of taxes, and indigent peasant, not all peasants, but the very poor peasants would be given land in compensation. See?
Amazing. Because we only have 6 minutes left, I don't see any like relevant questions yet. And we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and ask my last question to you, which is about how do you view the impact of this very important study on the field, and how do you think researchers, young researchers, future researchers, scholars trying to investigate the same topic, the same time period, how they can benefit from that? How do you see the benefits of the study for the field as a whole?
Okay, well, I think that scholars need to rethink 2 points. Okay, there are 2 important takeaways from my study. And I believe the first is that scholars need to rethink the idea that peasants chose to shun the state, that they wanted to distance themselves from the state. Instead, my study shows that peasants generally wanted to engage with the state. And the second point that I want to make, or that I think that is an important takeaway from my study, is that governance in 19th century Egypt was not always a top-down process where the ruling elite simply dictated to subordinate groups. Okay, this idea needs to be, scholars need to rethink this idea. Okay?
I would agree with you when it comes to the Delta, but when it comes to Upper Egypt, which, as you know, my research in the past was about Upper Egypt, I found that the state shunned peasants, and peasants shunned the state, and the peasants resisted violently the state. So the situation was a bit different, or was a lot different in Upper Egypt because of the nature of the crops that the state required them to harvest versus the cotton in Lower Egypt. Or what do you think? Would you agree?
I agree with you. I agree with you, because I did find cases where the peasants from Upper Egypt would make certain demands of the central government, and the central government was generally very stern with Upper Egyptian officials, with Upper Egyptian peasants, and would deny their requests and basically say, no, you have to do it this way. Let me give you just one very, very quick example. There is the system of masmuh al-masatib. Now, when we're talking about masmuh al-masatib, this is land that the state granted to village headmen in compensation for providing hospitality to travelers. Now, this was the system in Lower Egypt. In Upper Egypt, the system was cash-based, not land-based. Now, in 1856, the state instructed the villages of Upper Egypt to convert to the system of Lower Egypt. And when the senior officials of Upper Egypt tried to contest this decision, and they tried to explain that no, the Lower Egypt system will not work for us, the state, it seemed that it turned deaf. It wouldn't listen. And it said, no, this is how it's done in Lower Egypt. It's very successful there. And so we expect the peasants of Lower Egypt to do the same. Excuse me, we expect the peasants of Upper Egypt to do the same. And so when I explained this, actually, I talk about this in the book. I said, well, this decision is the result of two factors. On the one hand, the state was trying to modernize, and part of modernization means uniformity and standardization. So I can understand that's one way of explaining this kind of decision. But the other factor that we need to take into consideration is the fact that the central government seemed so indifferent and so harsh to it was so harsh with the peasants from the Upper Egypt region.
Yeah, Maha. So Laurie Phillips here has a great long comment that I don't think we have time to read. But she raises this very important question that you are kind of focusing on the good side of the relation between the state and peasants and ignoring, the ruthlessness sometimes that happens. Did you see revolts? I mean, I saw a lot in South Egypt. I saw a lot of peasants, low-class revolts against the state. Did you see revolts in the Delta that show us that there was similar degree of ruthlessness, or you didn't see a lot of revolts, which tells us that the state has more of a lenient way of dealing with the Delta peasants?
Okay, well, I do talk about this in the book, and I talk about peasant political activity very briefly. And here I highlight a point that was made by another Egyptian historian. This is Ahmed Halal. And he says that when peasants were unhappy, they relied on the instrument of the petition to articulate their concerns or their demands and their grievances to the state. And there were a lot of petitions that were sent. Now, when when peasants deemed these petitions useful and meaningful, they did not engage in revolt. Okay, they engaged in revolt when it seemed that the state was no longer paying attention to their petitions. So I think that's what was happening in Upper Egypt. But in Lower,
that is the difference. The state listened to the peasants in the Delta, whereas it did not in Upper Egypt.
Yes, and
revolted.
That is part of the situation. But another part of the situation is that, well, I show in the book that, for example, when we talk about tax increases, yes, there were other tax projects specified very high tax increases, but at the same time, the ruling elite that imposed or developed these new tax rates also understood that this was a point in time when Egyptian grains, when Egyptian crops were in high demand in Europe. And at the same time, the monopoly system was being dismantled, which meant that peasants could fetch high prices for their crops. So on the one hand, yes, they were asked to pay high taxes, but at the same time, as the foreign diplomatic correspondence tells us, that peasants could generally pay their taxes. And this is what I also saw by looking at the tax registers. I found that from the beginning of the period to the end of the period, the majority of the peasants remained economically viable. And this had to do with the kind of economic environment of the time. Like I said, the monopoly system was being dismantled, which meant that peasants had access to foreign merchants. They could sell their crops on the market, and they could fetch really high prices.
Right, yeah.
So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, the ruling elite could impose high tax rates, but at the same time, they knew that peasants could generally pay them.
Right, yeah, because they have the financial power, they have leverage vis-a-vis the state.
Well, it's not that they had leverage, it's just that the state wanted to maximize revenues, but at the same time, it didn't want to drive the peasantry into extreme poverty. This was the goose that laid the golden egg. Why kill it?
Absolutely, yeah, because this is the cotton producers, the cotton that Europe needs, that British textile industry needs. This the Delta peasants are the producers of this, yeah, golden egg of the Delta. Whereas in South Egypt, they did not produce cotton; it was sugar cane, so the treatment was totally different there. So I think, Khaled, how about one more question? I think this is a good question that Ahmed Mahdi poses here. Is that do you use any political science theoretical approaches in your study? Do you adopt any political sciences approaches here?
Well, yes, I look at the whole idea of the predatory state.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is what I do when I examine the nature of the laws that were developed by Abbas and Said Pasha. What I basically try to say is that the state was predatory. Okay, and by predatory, what Margaret Levy says is that this means that it tried to increase taxes, it tried to maximize revenue as much as it possibly could. Okay, so I look at this particular theory, but on the whole, no, this is this was not driven by ideas in political science, although I did use James Scott quite a bit, and I used his book on the moral economy. Moral economy to understand taxes and to understand tax policies and peasants' reactions to tax increases.
Great, yeah. Thank you so much, Maha. I really enjoyed it. I really learned a lot today from a very informative presentation, very rich material, amazing narratives you shared with us. So I think I'm gonna leave thank you again. I'm gonna leave the floor back to Khaled. Khaled?
Thank you so much, Dr. Maha and Dr. Zainab. This has been really insightful. Congratulations for the book. Thank you everyone who has joined us on Zoom or Facebook. We loved having you with us. And again, you can purchase your copy of the book from major booksellers and online book retailers worldwide, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.